Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defensive Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers what used to be known as the Global War on Terror and what we now call the Long War. I'm joined today by my friend, colleague, and co-editor at the Long War Journal, Caleb Weiss. Caleb is also a senior researcher at the Bridgeway Foundation. Hello, Caleb. Thanks for jumping in today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again. Although I need to stop thanking you.
You need to stop my job. Yeah. You're a partner here in crime. And today we have a very special guest. He's a friend of Generation Jihad, Dr. Craig Whiteside. Craig is an associate professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, as well as a former U.S. Army officer. Craig is also the author of the ISIS Reader Milestone Text of the Islamic State Movement, which I highly recommend. And I can't remember when we did this, Craig, but we did a podcast on this with Tom Jocelyn a couple of years ago. Craig, thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Generation Jihad.
Oh, it's an honor to be back. I've been reading you since I probably was in Iraq and ever since. And I'm really excited that you guys brought Caleb aboard. He's also someone I've been following for a long time and interacting with on our kind of nerding out on ancient AQIIS, other jihadi group history. So great to see him find a home here.
Oh yeah, Caleb's a gem. I'm glad he's now my co-host on Generation Jihad.
Both of you are way too kind. It was way too nice of an intro there.
Well, Caleb, it's well earned. I don't. People don't know this, but Caleb, when you contacted us years ago, you're still in. Were you in high school at the time?
No, it's freshman year of college, so undergrad.
I can't believe how long we working on it. It really has been a pleasure and an honor to watch you grow into your own, to become a colleague and become a friend. Look, anyone that knows me knows that I am not one to blow smoke up anyone's ass.
Bill?
For me to say that about the Caleb, that's I'd like to think that that's a high compliment, but it's one that you earned, Caleb. So, okay. I know we're heaping a lot of praise on you. I'm sure if you could all see the video, Caleb's probably blushing, but it's certainly
way too uncomfortable.
It's all right. We'll get beyond that. Craig, you mentioned something, the years ago, how long we've been doing this. It's something that's really been sort of turning in my head. I had a friend who was reviewing my work, doing some work on these Al-Qaeda in Iraq / Islamic State of Iraq years ago. And he's like, Bill, wow, I just can't believe how deep and how, he's mentioning things that I hadn't thought about for well over a decade. It's really strange when you've been in this business for a long time and you get to that point where you're covering different things. I mean, I've, focused a lot of my coverage on Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last, I'd say, decade, but, still have an eye on Iraq and Syria. It's such a difficult job. And it's really interesting when you say that, how long we've been in this business. And if you had any thoughts on that, Craig, I'm just curious to see what you think.
One thing I really like to follow is leadership and AQI, ISI, Islamic States, leaders, their history. The best source I've found, and we've cited you a lot in ISIS Reader on that, is the leaders. You pay attention to personalities where I think it's something that the field doesn't do a great job of. They just are like, how do you keep all these names straight? Like, look, this is important stuff. Like leadership of the militant groups that are our adversaries, they really do shape their tactics and strategies, and they interact with this in that way. And you probably, if you have one article, you have, in the Long War Journal, going all the way back into the thick of the fight. If you've got one article, you've got 100 articles on this person was picked up, this person picked up. At the time, it seems insignificant, but then you can go back when they were famous later on and be like, here's this person again. They keep popping up. You start doing patterns, and it's been really helpful.
A little secret. I didn't start the Long War Journal for people to read. I started it for myself. It literally was my journal because I'm not good with remembering names, and these names are real difficult to remember. But yeah, that's it. I mean, really,
it's not even their real name sometimes, right?
Exactly. Sometimes they make it easy with these kunyans, right? But yeah, it was really because, I mean, I could go back and remember seeing Sirajuddin Haqqani, right? Now the deputy emir and interior minister for the Taliban. I remember seeing a U.S. wanted poster, and he was like $75,000. I was like, "Ooh, interesting, son of Sirajuddin Haqqani, right? Let me track this guy." Then he gets designated. Then he's, and he becomes. Yeah. I think that's like a perfect example of, sometimes it goes nowhere. Sometimes you look at these people, but you start building the database, so to speak, of these interesting characters, and we see them pop up. By some of these names I've seen pop up in like Osama bin Laden's documents, right? And in other documents that come up. It's just interesting business. But speaking of leadership, that's where we're going to start today. We're obviously, Craig is an expert on the premier expert on the Islamic State. And so we're going to take a deep dive into the Islamic State. And let's start, Craig, with the recent news on the Islamic State. Over the weekend, Turkish President Recep Erdogan, he claimed that the National Intelligence Organization killed the current ISIS emir Abu Hussein al-Husseini al-Qureshi. Erdogan said that they were tracking his movements for some time. U.S. official told Jeff Selden at Voice of America that Qureshi's death cannot be confirmed, and I'm going to put this in quotes, "We have no information that would support this claim," end quote. One of the things I've said for quite some time, well over decades maybe, these guys are vampires. Unless you drive a stake through the heart, chop off the head, and expose them to sunlight, they aren't truly dead. And I've documented numerous cases of this over time. Erdogan's claim, which it seems awfully Pakistani to me. The Pakistanis from in the mid 2000s to the 2010s, when they needed good press, they would claim they killed a senior Al Qaeda or Pakistani Taliban leader, or a leader of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or the Turkestan Islamic Party. That was when they would want to placate the Chinese, and then often these guys weren't really dead. Anyway, that we don't really know what's going on here. At the time of this recording, often these podcasts are put out several days after. They got to go through production. Danielle, our producer, does a fantastic job. Thank you, Danielle. She's fantastic. So at the moment, we don't know. The U.S. officials are basically indicating that we don't see evidence of this. What do you make of the Turkish claims, Craig? And what do we know about the identity of the latest Qureshi, and do you think he's an effective leader?
Yeah, those are some good questions. First got to take, or one thing, having studied leadership, like I said, I've had a focus on leadership and how they shape their strategy, political worldview since my dissertation, back, over a decade ago, Washington State. You got to take all of these things with a grain of salt. I mean, we haven't even done a good job as analysts or even the IC in knowing exactly who these leaders were. There are times we had very good knowledge. There are times that we've struggled and even made mistakes. Abu Umar al-Baghdadi is a pretty famous one. You covered it back in the day. You even have like who is this guy? Who's right? Is he real? Is he not? So, a Turkish claim on this with the U.S. not immediately confirming definitely would put a lot of, big grain of salt, large grains of salt on this particular, and then wait and see before jumping in on, any kind of analysis. That said, it made me think of a couple of things. One, when they announced, the Islamic State's lost two of its very top leaders, quote unquote Caliph, in the last year plus, slightly plus. That is a lot compared to the organization's been around for, better part of 15 years plus as the Islamic State movement, and even longer before that. And, they've had leaders, but I mean, they've never lost leaders at this particular rate. It's quite dangerous for them, even though they've structured their leadership succession for these guys to be replaceable, even anonymous, even, hey, these guys are heroes, but they're not as important as the organization and our ideology and so forth. And that's what allows them to move on. But but still they go to great lengths to protect their leaders, and for obvious reasons. And so this is not good, right? And if this happened again, this would be the third leader in 14 months. And that is a rate we've never seen before at all. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was the leader of the organization for 9 years, right? And so this would be a high turnover. It's already a high turnover. It'd be an exceptionally high turnover rate. The other thing is when they announced Abu al-Hussein as the replacement for Abu al-Hassan, who is the replacement for Abu Ibrahim, all of this within a year plus, we didn't get the kind of details that they even at least offer to support this anonymous person taking over really what's a global enterprise, right? I mean, it's a leap of faith. Now, these are religious folks, so faith is not, that's not foreign to them, a leap of faith, but they didn't even, we don't know what experience this person had, where they worked. Usually they're Sharia officials or judges, the chief judges, and they've worked in that realm to give them the religious legitimacy to be the caliph. We don't have that information on them. We have the Husseini Qurayshi traditional tie that IS has kind of made up for its caliph. But at the same time, there's we don't have any kind of background. And it's not entirely sure that they're not out of first generation leaders that the United States knows, right? The United States can confirm the death of all of these people to date because they have biometrics on them from Camp Bucca, right? Which is another topic altogether. It's not clear that this latest person is known as, let's say, the last leader, Abu Hassan. The U.S. was able to biometrically confirm his death, at the hands of a Syrian militant group in southwestern Syria, which is also the first time that, U.S. top tier forces weren't involved in the death of an IS leader, going all the way back to the founder Zarqawi, right? So there's a lot of red flashing lights, I think, for this organization, even if this is not true.
Yeah. And I want to 2 real quick points. Clearly it's much more dangerous to keep your leadership based in Iraq and Syria than it is in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Look, Al-Qaeda has only had 3 leaders since its founding.
Very stable in comparison.
1998. I mean, how many U.S. presidents have we had since 1998? So
Zawahiri was a co-founder. He was kind of like baked into the leadership succession, Yeah,
and Saif al-Adil, who we all believe to be his successor, was one of the founding members of Al-Qaeda and was on their committee since, probably at least 20, 30 years. So, Caleb, any thoughts on this?
So a couple. I think one thing that, when we talk about rating Abu al-Hussein as an effective leader, a lot of people have made the case that these anonymous leaders are sort of hurting the brand of, not knowing who they are hurts the rank and file. But I kind of take a different approach to that, what Craig said, these are religious people. They're very driven by faith. To them, what matters the most is, religious credentials. If the Islamic State says they have their religious credentials, these people are going to take it at face value. And you've seen that across the board whenever the Islamic State announces a new caliph, all these different groups from around the world, wholeheartedly just, repledge their bayah to the new guy. There is, of course, there is things happening behind the scenes, but for what it's, we can tell, is it really doesn't matter who necessarily these guys are, as long as, they have their religious credentials, and that the Islamic State's, Central Shura says that this is our new guy. And that's really all that matters. And I think that's, we can go down the rabbit hole from there of whether or not he's actually effectively leading. But, I think at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily matter as much for the rank and file, if that makes sense. Especially as you've seen across Africa, where, the Islamic State is expanding, across the Sahel and DRC and Mozambique. What's happening in Iraq and Syria doesn't really affect these guys at all. The Islamic State has, command and control hubs around the world, these regional offices. Most of the, interaction with quote unquote IS Central or IS Core is coming from those guys. So really, it doesn't matter as much of whether or not, they're getting these micromanaged orders from the top more than it does that, this guy has the religious credentials to be the caliph, which is what we want and care about anyway. If that rambling makes sense.
Oh, it makes absolute sense, Caleb. I think that, we see this but with Al Qaeda as well. I think a big analytical mistake is often, well, Zawahiri was uncharismatic, or we didn't know who this Islamic State leader, so therefore these groups are in disarray. But it isn't what we think about it. It's what as you noted, the rank and file thinks about it, what the regional leaders, the members of the Shura. The rank and file in Al Qaeda West Africa province swears allegiance to its local emir, and they're trusting them to trust the central leadership. That's how that works. And I think there's a great misunderstanding, a great I always balk at the charisma. Look, I'm gonna be honest, bin Laden didn't look very charismatic to me. He looked like a mopey guy sitting in a cave, and he's always slouched over. But that didn't mean that Al Qaeda members didn't see him as charismatic. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, we saw him once in a video, and he's wearing a watch loose on his wrist that he kind of looked like didn't look very charismatic to me, but he certainly was able to spawn a movement. I don't put my perception of charisma or what I think it's what they do, what the followers and the lower level leaders, the regional leaders. Those are the guys that matter, and neither of these groups has fallen apart with the death of their emir. Sure, they have troubles, but
right, there's always internal squabbling too. Of course, there's always going to be internal squabbling over leadership or direction a group is headed. But at the end of the day, it really only matters with these jihadis of what is the religious credentials? What are we actually fighting for? We're trusting our local emir, who trusts the bigger emir, and we go from there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I believe it was said Saif al-Adil was against the 9/11 attack, right? Did he resign from Al Qaeda? Did he break off and form his own group? No, he disagreed with strategy. I mean, just look at our government today. You think we look real united when the rest of the world looks to us? So, all right, let's move on. So the U.S. has targeted a number of Islamic State leaders in both Iraq and Syria over the last several months. There's been some, at least as the U.S. Central Command has identified them as high-value targets, senior leaders. One of them, Abdullah Hadi Mahmoud al-Haji Ali, and Khalid Aid Ahmad al-Jabouri. Both of these individuals were identified as senior ISIS leaders, and they were involved in terrorist plots in Europe and the Middle East. I believe, and Caleb, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe a couple of these guys have been identified as the new batch of leaders. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe Hajj Ali, and then there was a Yemeni figure.
That's right. The Yemeni was also identified as such. So they're basically new batch of leadership since the fall of the Islamic State's physical caliphate. Craig, what do you think the current leadership looks like in the Islamic State? Are they still organized? Do you agree with our assessment? Is it possible that is the Islamic State moving towards a more geographically dispersed model, much like Al Qaeda? Caleb and I have a thought about that. We think we have seen some evidence. What are your thoughts on that, Craig?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know, even though a lot of us study these movements, organizations, and watch how they shift and turn. I'll be honest, I've gotten surprised many times by the turns that they've taken, their insistence on external operations, as you pointed out, which tends to, of all the jihadi or extremists, let's just say extremists problems that the U.S. is worried about for its regional stability or its allies and partners, it's the desire to do external ops that gets the most attention. Like that rises that's why Al-Shabaab is higher on the targeting list and priority list for, let's say, AFRICOM than maybe IS West Africa sometimes, even though I think IS West Africa is the more potent threat to a very Nigeria, which is a a partner that we have and an important U.S. national interest. It's that external, and yet they continue to do this, right? They continue to do that, and it's just baked into their ideology and their DNA. And so we've also seen these reports coming out about ISK from the CENTCOM commander about, that it's possible that the U.S. has disrupted, plots for external operations emanating out of ISK, and that maybe inspirational plots, but certainly there's also concerns that they could develop operational capability. I think the quote from CENTCOM was, within 6 months. Of course, we've heard that before as well, but unlike Jelani and other groups that have kind of shied away from that in order to get the spotlight off of them, these Islamic State particularly, and I think Al Qaeda aspirationally, do want to continue to have that external operation capability. And then, the U.S. counter targeting of these leaders that you mentioned in Syria, for example, it's very typical of the IS model, which another reason that the killing the caliph is in the kind of frequency that we've seen is unusual, because normally they have that second tier of leaders who are actually running the organization, the delegated committee. They are typically also responsible for that external operation, monitoring media, things that still are working within a much degraded Islamic State. Hammering that tier below the caliph, which as I understand it, these targets were in that high level tier, show you just, again, the punishment that IS is receiving in both Iraq and Syria, which is making it, I think it's putting a strain on what Caleb mentioned earlier, which I think is a thread that is worth kind of pulling on, which is, how does Islamic State, in contrast to Al Qaeda, run a global enterprise that was more centralized, I think, or at least attempted to be more centralized in managing the affiliates than Al Qaeda ever could? I mean, I think Al Qaeda wanted to, but just couldn't. Islamic State tried to put in both infrastructure and guidelines, and even selecting leaders of Yemen or IS Yemen or IS West Africa, right, with Shakal, the whole Shakal mess. It's impossible for them to do that right now with the pressure that's on them in Iraq and Syria. And it's, I wouldn't put a lot of money on it, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some cracks. As we teach at the War College, what's this group's center of gravity? It is the leadership in Iraq and Syria, yeah. I think more so than Al Qaeda.
I concur. I mean, that to me does, because they, one of the reason the Islamic State has major disagreements with other non-Islamic State jihadist groups is because they want everyone to swear allegiance to their would-be caliph. I mean, that's a key part of all of this. So Al Qaeda really is organized to just serve as the base of the jihad. That's literally the name, what Al Qaeda is. And it learned, once its central leadership was targeted in the drone campaign in northwestern Pakistan, that it had to in the late 2000s, that, we saw this in the bin Laden documents. They're saying we got to start moving people out. And then we see people like Nasser al-Wahishi, bin Laden's former aide de camp. He becomes the general manager for Al Qaeda, and he's not based in Afghanistan, Pakistan. We see, the current emir of AQIM, as well as Shabab, Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, as well as Shabab, are in the line of succession, according to the United Nations sanctions and monitoring team. And I think it's going to be harder for the Islamic State to move towards this model, but it's probably one that they need to move to if they want to remain a viable organization. It has to, because this is the key. I think what we're seeing here in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. still has capacity in this area, which it doesn't have in Afghanistan, Pakistan anymore, to target Al Qaeda's senior leadership. We're able to go after the Islamic State's leadership in Iraq and Syria because we have the ability to base troops in the region. We have U.S. troops in Syria, we have U.S. troops in Iraq, and we have an actual partner in Iraq that is willing to go after the Islamic State. In Syria, it's a little more complicated, but we do have partners there that we could work through. I think I've been following the CENTCOM statements. They at the end of every month, they issue a statement. They've been executing anywhere from like 30 to 50 raids a month against the Islamic State. At least the last several months, last like 3 to 4 months, they've been averaging somewhere in that. And believe it or not, I was shocked by this. There's more raids occurring in Iraq than there are in Syria, but it does seem like the senior leaderships are being targeted more inside of Syria.
Caleb, I got a question for you. Like, how do you see this contrast with Al Qaeda and the way these kind of global enterprises? The contrast to that, I think, is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you touched on this, so that, you know, AQ has always been more globally dispersed. Their whole thing is playing the long game. They don't necessarily need to have all of these groups pledge allegiance to them publicly, at least, or, you know, be fully integrated within Al Qaeda, you know, their command and control network. It's beyond that. Al Qaeda literally is what Bill said is the base. It is there to foment, support, instigate whatever Islamic insurgencies around the world. So they work through the locals, and most of these groups are, you know, tied into the local aspect, but at the same time, their top leaders, as Bill mentioned in Shabab and AQIM, are more than likely within Al Qaeda's, you know, globalized command structure. Post the drone strike campaign of the late 2000s and early 2010s, Al Qaeda definitely had to move people around the world to act as, you know, this, you know, what we would call Al Qaeda core or Al Qaeda central. And as you know, you touched on, Craig, the Islamic State was never about that. It was always about the centrality of the organization, of we are one, everyone must subsume under us, under this caliphate. And I don't disagree that the center of gravity is and will probably always be Iraq and Syria. That is just their bread and butter. That is what they've based their legitimacy on, their legacy on as well. But, you know, we do see sort of indications that, you know, the Islamic State, due to this pressure, has already made, you know, some sort of, you know, commitments to move leadership more abroad. And that's what we were talking about earlier with these regional offices. So regional offices like, you know, the, you know, Al-Qarar office in Somalia, which sort of acts as this command and control hub for the Islamic State central leadership to, you know, act somewhat unilaterally in conducting operations or overseeing operations throughout much of East and Southern Africa. And I think, you know, the former leader of Al-Qarar, Bilal Sudani, this Sudanese, you know, Islamic State leader who was killed recently in a U.S. raid, you know, not only was he overseeing all these operations in, you know, eastern and southern Syria, including, you know, actual attacks, the movement of money, stuff like that, is he was also tied to the Abbey Gate suicide, you know, bombing in Afghanistan during the withdrawal. The U.S. said that there was enough evidence that he, you know, directed that funding. He, you know, provided some sort of support for that cell, which to me indicates that Bilal Sudani was more than just, you know, this regional Islamic State leader in Africa. He fits the profile more of an Islamic State central leader. Of, you know, obviously he's put outsized importance outside of, you know, a quote unquote designated AO. To me, that screams way bigger than the organization. And I think, you know, there are others out there like him that we may not know yet, at least in the public sphere, who are acting in that similar role. So whereas the Islamic State will always be, you know, at least ideologically, rhetorically, whatever, focused and based in Iraq and Syria, they're going to have these, you know, centralized nodes elsewhere around the world out of necessity. You know, just as Al-Qaeda learned they had to do that, the Islamic State seems to be learning that.
Caleb, you know, you had mentioned the unknowns here, right? We don't know who Al-Hajj al-Ali and al-Jabouri and al-Yemeni. You and I remember when they're being killed, you know, we're going, who are these guys? There's nothing out there. These guys look like ghosts to us, and we're trying to find out information. Now, it could be, you know, if we had their real names, it might be easier to find. CENTCOM issued minimal information on them. So we're all left guessing, were these important guys? I'm guessing they are, given particularly the fact in a couple of these raids, the U.S. put boots on the ground. Syria is a very dangerous place to operate for many reasons. So that indicates to me. And also I want to mention something, you know, I think that, Craig, you touched on this, you know, and this is a big analytical problem, another big analytical problem that I always somewhat bothers me. You know, we're focused on, not we here and not the three of us, but you see this a lot from political and military and intelligence leadership. The focus is, well, they haven't launched any attacks, or the attacks are down, or sure, that's an indicator of something. But to me, what always bothers me about these groups is them building capacity. The most important thing to both Al Qaeda and the Islamic State is to reestablish the caliphate. And the tactic of a terror attack against the West is just that. It's a tactic. It's one we have to fight. But to me, always the greater danger is them taking territory, overthrowing governments, taking control of countries like Afghanistan, like parts of Mali, like parts of Somalia. That to me is always the greater danger, and one that just seems to be ignored. And instead we just focus on, well, were they able to launch attacks against us or not?
Right. I mean, just to jump in here real quick, I mean, shout out to Thomas Josselin and David Gartenstein-Ross and their book. They talk about, yes, everyone always talks about whether or not Al Qaeda has launched an external attack, or whether or not they're able to launch these external attacks abroad, but it was never wholly about that. Doing attacks abroad has always been a means to justify the ends, which is the collapse of these local regimes to generate, or
drive the U.S. out of the Middle East,
drive their allies out to reestablish the caliphate. It was never the prime focus of these groups. It is a means to do the local. It's where this whole dichotomy of local and global is kind of messed up. Of like, we're looking at it as Western analysts and not as jihadis look at it, which is it's all combined into one fight.
Yeah,
right. They don't make the distinction between CT and counterinsurgency on their side, insurgency like we do, right? Is this CT or Cohen? They're like, whatever. This is the same thing, man. We integrate these well, as have we at times. But I agree. There's this weird circle where like they're doing external ops, which then justifies us to focus on them for external ops. To preventing external terrorist attacks. It's not their main reason for being, right. It's more the state projects or the local projects, as we've been talking about. But at the same time, like that's the most danger to us is destabilizing regional structure, let's say the Middle East or anywhere, Philippines, you name it, Africa. And and yet that's what we don't talk about, right? We justify our presence, action, raids, all about trying to turn these things off. And it just seems to be like missing the forest for the trees. But then they help us out by doing external operations, and then it kind of justifies our focus, even though it's the wrong focus. I don't. Sometimes it's hard.
Exactly, like it is ignoring. They're building, and as they gain more territory, they build more capacity to conduct those external attacks. That's what we should always be worried about. Like Zalmay Khalilzad recently came out and said, well, there's no threat from Afghanistan because they haven't launched any attacks. At the Long War Journal, we rebutted that. We note that Al Qaeda is regathering there, and it's the long-term threat. We're looking at the immediate, that attack that might happen tomorrow. Yes, absolutely, we want to be targeting, we want to capture or kill these external operations planners, but that's just going after the tactic of terrorism. But if you really want to solve this problem, you got to stop these groups from metastasizing and taking control.
That's U.S. policy in a nutshell, though. It's always been more reactive than it is, proactive.
Yeah, and
we wonder why we get 9/11. And go ahead, Craig. Sorry.
You look at the previous administration, the Obama administration, really didn't understand IS when it came up, thought it was more like the Taliban, or, that it wasn't, they weren't that concerned that they were taking land. It's when they started doing external operations or killing hostages or doing genocide. They're like, oh, no, we really have to intervene here. And I think that's to your point, right? We constantly make this mistake about these state building projects as being, possibly innocuous or not necessarily a threat. And I don't, certainly from a liberal international perspective, the U.S. should be fighting these as the authoritarian, kind of regimes with poor human rights records that we would anybody else in the state structure, even though these are non-states.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Islamic State was JV until they got promoted to the varsity, for sure. So, well, This is Generation Jihad. I'm Bill Roggio, joined by my co-host Caleb Weiss. And today we have our special guest is Dr. Craig Whiteside, associate professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College and author of the ISIS Reader, milestone text of the Islamic State movement. Again, I highly recommend it. Give it a read. I'll be honest, don't get a chance to read too many books at this point because I've read so much during the day to try and stay. But that was one book in the last several years that I actually read cover to cover. Craig, great stuff.
Oh, thanks for that.
No, it's
and we wrote it for people like you, to be honest.
Yeah. Well,
and with help from people like you, for sure.
Much appreciated. So let's take a look. You have had a lot of reporting lately. The Islamic State, in the Khorasan province. Of course, that's Islamic State, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Central Asia. The Washington Post recently wrote an article where it talks about how the Islamic State is increasing its capacity inside Afghanistan, and it's facilitating and plotting a global attacks. Again, this gets back to, of course, everybody loves that, right? That makes it the real threat. Of course, the Islamic State is the enemy of the Taliban and Al Qaeda, so that does complicate things there for the Islamic State. Yet, even though it's the underdog in Afghanistan, it's still finding some capacity to do this. Craig, does this comport with what you're seeing on how the Islamic State is reorganizing since the fall of its empire in Iraq and Syria? How do you rate this threat? Is this a significant threat, as was put out there by the Washington Post? Is it an emerging threat? Is it a nascent threat?
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I think I've always thought the Islamic State had tough sledding there because of the dominance of the Taliban and their association with Al Qaeda, which, after 2013-14 makes them, mortal enemies. The one thing from studying the Islamic State I've found is they're quite strategic in the sense, like, they have always prioritized the near, the near enemy. But in this case, that typically tends to be rival jihadi groups. That's something I know Caleb's looked a lot into in his research, but they really do focus on that. So Afghanistan's a tough place because it's got multiplicity of rivals for them, and yet it seems to be the franchise outside of Africa that's doing the best, right? Iraq, if you look at the stats, is plummeting and hasn't hit bottom yet, and yet despite the tough sledding in Afghanistan with the Taliban, who's pretty ruthless against them, as well as Al Qaeda, who probably is helping the Taliban in that regard. I think the concerns that CENTCOM has is valid, even if I'm less sure about their capability to do external ops out of Afghanistan. I think I'm always wondering, like, what exactly that means.
The Islamic State Khorasan province, it has a lot going against, as you said, it's tough sledding. It doesn't have a state sponsor. It doesn't control territory. It's my way or the highway approach doesn't win it allies with other local jihadist groups. Although I do think there may be some advantages that it has, particularly with groups like the Turkestan Islamic Party. I think and the IMU, and the Taliban is sort of playing patty cakes particularly with the Chinese government, while the Uyghurs are, put into re-education or concentration camps. There could be some poaching going on there. We've seen some evidence that that's happening, but that's limited. I do, but it piques my interest. And if the Islamic State is able to devote some capacity to look at that, it has to make you wonder, what are its capabilities?
The reason Afghanistan is also tough sledding is kind of where the starting position for IS in Khorasan versus where it was in Iraq and Syria. Like, so, a partner and I, partially inspired by some of the work Caleb did earlier on Ansar al-Sunnah, and hopefully we can circle back to that. But we wrote a paper about the political consolidation of Islamic State in Iraq before 2014, right? The period that people don't really look at. And we went all the way back to when they were, before AQI, when they're Tawhid wal Jihad, right, under Zarqawi, just starting out. They progressed through what we just called, different phases of consolidation. First, they cooperated with other groups. Then they competed. When they became Al Qaeda in Iraq, it's kind of like a signal. The reason they did so many name changes is kind of signals their kind of shift from cooperation, straight cooperation across the board with anybody, to competing with the other jihadi groups, including Ansar al-Islam /Sunnah, And then eventually, once they gained enough strength, became dominant in their local sphere in Iraq, then they were coercive. Like, you have to join us or else. And then they were, they were always, quite violent in that. It wasn't always a peaceful competition, but nonetheless, they still competed with people, but not necessarily violently. But it's when they get into a coercive phase that everyone understands that they're out for them and they're going to dominate and become hegemonic. You saw the same thing in Syria. In Afghanistan, they start off as the underdog, right? The Taliban is the one that's hegemonic, or at least has aspirations of complete hegemonic. We're the Islamic Emirate. We'll tolerate you, weird Salafis, in this corner here until we realize you actually have you're going to challenge us. So Islamic State just started so far behind. It's just amazing they've gotten to where they have, considering they didn't have the advantages that they did in Iraq of this very patient, slow, phased, consolidation approach.
Yeah, I concur. They started. I mean, it began as basically cast off from Al Qaeda, from the movement of Taliban in Pakistan, and disaffected members of those groups, as well as the Afghan Taliban. So they weren't the influential leaders within these groups. As you noted, they started as the underdog. They immediately clashed with the Taliban. Like, within months after their formation, they were fighting pitched battles, and the Taliban wiped the floor with them. Obviously not enough that it's eliminated, but that's where I get back to, despite all of those challenges of the, it's significant underdog status, it certainly gives me a lot of concern that there may be something there. But, at the end of the day, I look at what the Taliban has, how it's come on top in this conflict, the fact that it's defeated, defeated the United States in Afghanistan. That's really, really difficult message for the Islamic State to deal with.
There might be some comparative analysis there with this underdog story compared to, a more hegemonic jihadi force in a certain area. And one area that, people might be able to look at for comparison between IS, Khorasan, is the Sahel, where the Islamic State was definitely the underdog there when they first emerged in 2015. I mean, the jihadi scene in the Sahel was exclusively Al Qaeda until they broke off, and even then, it wasn't until 2016-ish that the Islamic State actually recognized these guys as their branch in the Sahel. And even then, they weren't given province status. They weren't given provincial status until 2019. And then since then, they've had ebbs and flows with Al Qaeda, and then now they're basically controlling an entire province of Mali. I mean, this is kind of a similar underdog story where this one group had to face all these hegemonic challenges with Al Qaeda. There were definitely clashes between them and Al Qaeda that, both sides won some battles, both sides lost some battles. And then now the Islamic State in the Sahel is on this upswing that is, wholly usurped Al Qaeda from one province of Mali.
Very interesting, Caleb. I just think that the Taliban has certain things that we're talking about dispersed groups.
Fair, but like, if you look at northern Mali, like, the state isn't there. In most parts of northern Mali, Al Qaeda certainly is the government. I mean, you look at the desert of Timbuktu or Kidal, it's Al Qaeda. So in a similar case where they do have they are the state. In most cases, you do have sort of the same things the Taliban are doing or were doing at that time. Al Qaeda was also doing in Mali. I don't know. It's not a one-for-one comparative. Definitely something there that, scholars or analysts, researchers, whatever, could probably look at of, the Islamic State has been underdogs, not only in Afghanistan, but elsewhere, but yet still survive and still be able to be on the upswing despite massive challenges from a rival jihadi group.
And I think one thing that works against the Islamic State is every country in the region is willing to work with the Taliban against the Islamic State. China, Russia, Pakistan,
basically same thing
Iran.
in the Sahel. I mean, you basically have state forces and non-state forces, especially non-state forces, working with Al Qaeda against the Islamic State.
Sure. Yeah. Well, then certainly, if you certainly an interesting research project.
Yeah, there you go. Shout out to whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like right there.
Once you write that paper, whoever you are, maybe you get on the Generation Jihad and we could talk about it.
Absolutely.
Craig, you have any thoughts on that before we move on to the last question?
No, it just reminds me that one, don't underestimate
Yeah.
Islamic State, because they had advantages both in Syria and Iraq that other groups didn't have: organizational experience, et cetera, money, and they kind of cemented that, and that was fundamental in their ability to establish a caliphate and elevate their leader to a caliph status, and then claim at least partial a competitor in the global jihad enterprise, which was new for them. So everything's always changing. It's always different from different places, like Caleb's talking about.
Yeah.
But their ability to survive as an underdog, as Caleb made a really great analogy there. It is surprising. Like you just can't, even though with all that odds stuck against them, there's something there, whether it's their organizational skills or their financing or something, that allows them to be competitive even when they're an underdog, as you put it.
Yeah, and I would add branding to that too. I think they really do appeal to the more red-blooded jihadi, right? The jihad now, the caliphate now crowd really does seem to gravitate towards.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's your point with those disaffected Central Asians in Afghanistan, right? So these guys really want to attack Uzbekistan or Tajikistan or China,
yeah,
but the Taliban's not going to allow that. But
right, not now.
Guess who is going to allow that?
Yeah.
Islamic State,
exactly, and that's what gives them the ability to survive and perhaps, I mean, it's a long war. We'll see if they'll thrive. We could certainly have this. It'd be interesting to have this conversation 3 years from now, 5 years from now. I'd rather them all be defeated and I could move on, get a different career, but I don't see that happening. Definitely. Maybe I could flip burgers instead. That would be nice. So, Craig, tell us about what your current research interest. And I hear you have an upcoming project on Ansar al-Islam / Ansar al-Sunnah. Talk a little bit about this. I think this will spawn a whole conversation in itself.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, we're kind of building off this paper that I just referenced, which was the political consolidate. We called it state accompli instead of fait accompli, political consolidation of the Islamic State. And that was published in Studies in Conflict and Terrorism a little over a year ago online. And, from that, as I mentioned, it kind of, some of the inspiration of that comes from some of Caleb's early work and on Ansar al-Islam. So one of the projects I'm working on under Mohammed Hafez, who's a NPS researcher here, who's pretty prolific in this space. I'm sure you've read his stuff, Suicide Bombers in Iraq. We're working a workshop under him on the dog that didn't bark. Like, why didn't Ansar al-Islam / Ansar al-Sunnah / eventually Ansar al-Islam again, why didn't they join Islamic State? And it's kind of the reverse of that political consolidation paper, which is, the outlier throughout our entire research in the paper of all of these other groups. Islamic Army, got people you were running up against, Bill, when you were embedded in Iraq multiple times. Mujahideen Army, all the different jihadi groups of different flavors, from hardcore Salafi all the way down to kind of Muslim Brotherhood-ish and others. Once we dove into the political character of them, it was really interesting to see how some of them kind of splintered apart, and some of them went to the Sawar awakening, and then others went to early IS, and then the question, we tend to beat up IS for not listening to Al Qaeda central leadership, something I know you've and your colleague had spent a lot of time thinking about and talking about in Long War Journal. Why didn't Ansar al-Islam / Ansar al-Sunnah listen to Al Qaeda's repeated kind of, hey, we need to unify jihad in Iraq, and they just wouldn't. So why was that? Why didn't they see the benefit of kind of joining forces? Because they cooperated a lot. They collaborated a lot. We know that. We have a lot of evidence for that. There are even people who were in both organizations at the same time, which I have trouble getting my head around. And so the complexities of them are crazy. And so that's one of my projects. The other one, you won't be surprised by this, is trying to go back and reconstruct the foundation of Islamic State. So just going back into kind of the history and archives and looking at different perspectives. Like, how did the Islamic State form and appoint Abu Umar, this anonymous leader? This circles back to kind of the beginning of our discussion on how do they get away with appointing anonymous leaders? And then how, their transition from Mujahideen Shura Council / AQI into, the establishment of the Islamic State. It's kind of been covered in bits and pieces, but we don't have the full story. Like, we don't understand why Abu Hamza was was a quick replacement for Zarqawi, but then he steps down in the formation of the Islamic State, and then the various political aspects of that, him being a foreigner in Iraq, and then them appointing Abu Umar, who was Iraqi, but because of a lot of the uncertainty and clarity and misinformation about who Abu Umar was and why he was selected and how that all went down in the 6 months after Zarqawi was killed in 2006, to me is really fundamental to understanding Islamic State. And that's my other project. It's almost there. We've gotten all of these threads. There's some secrets we're hoping to get out that we've kind of stumbled across. But I tell you, the really interesting thing is that we kind of think that the Islamic State is this, like, okay, we captured people, they went to Buqa, then we left, and then they got out of Buqa and they finished the Islamic State. And it's actually a much more complex story about that. And I think this. It was a little bit of more of a revolving door in Camp Buqa, and we were capturing these guys over and over again. And 2 to 3 times sometimes. The top leadership in AQI in 2006, really the Mujahideen Shura Council at that time, that's how they described themselves in their interrogation, is the same leadership in 2014 with certain exceptions. And to me, that's just stunning and it kind of helps us understand the continuity of this movement over time.
I'm going to ask you a quick question. Now, my understanding was that this is on the Islamic State of Iraq, that Abu Ayyub al-Masri was the war minister and was killed alongside of Abu Umar al-Baghdadi back in 2010. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. But that was a step down for him because he had led Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And essentially, even though there were other groups that joined Islamic State of Iraq when it was formed in October 2006, 80 to 90% of it was the AQI because it was the most dominant group that there was. So that's just, we really haven't peeled that back. Why? And in fact, the American military kind of sometimes alluded to the fact that Abu Hamza was still the guy in charge, and Abu Umar was just kind of this kind of fake figurehead stuff. That's not how internal documents or even the other jihadi groups talk about. And in some cases, Al Qaeda, even some of the Abbottabad documents, understand that it's Abu Umar who's running the group, and we just can't get over the fact that the foreigner took this demotion to be part of the state project, which was in a lot of ways very different from AQI.
If I remember correctly, it's been a couple of years since I looked at these docs related to the war, but I believe at least one of the docs you were referring to is Al Qaeda is talking about it's more important for them to have this political face, have this political movement, than it is to have that central leadership over the Mujahideen Shura Council. And I think that says a lot of where Al Qaeda's headspace was and has been for decades, and something that sort of written off about them of. This is also their, MO, like what they're fighting for. And here you are back in 2006 of them telling, al-Masri, take a back seat. This political project's more important. Way back then.
Yeah, and it shows maybe the consensus, the decision making. To me, it's an insight to the decision making, both externally from Al Qaeda Central, but also internally, like the group. I think Al Qaeda is kind of shouting things from the top bleacher from where they were at, but it's the group that's on the ground struggling with not just the U.S., not just the U.S. relentless counterterrorism pressure. It's like, how do we get as many people on board with this political project, the tribes, all this other stuff? And obviously they failed, right? It didn't work, but that's because they're tougher problem. And if you go back and look at the documents, and from that perspective, you realize what Zarqawi's trying to do, with the bombing of Samarra, the mosque in Samarra and stuff like that. They're all trying to figure out ways to unite the jihadists and failing in some ways, largely because they all have different views. That's one thing we found in that project, the political consolidation project, was like every one of these groups doesn't have the same vision of what some kind of Sunni leadership of either parts or all of Iraq would look like, and what there would have for inspiration. And obviously the Islamic State has the one that they actually put into being, so we have a better understanding of that. But there was 6 or 7, 8 other competing visions of what Sunni Iraq should look like, or Iraq under Sunni leadership should look like, either one. And they kind of never really differentiated those, even though one's realistic and one is not.
Quick point on what we're talking about with Ansar Islam and Ansar Sunni and these Bin Laden docs is there are some interesting docs in there talking about, it's either Bin Laden or Atiyah al-Libi talking to, Abdullah Shafi, the leader of Ansar Islam, Ansar Sunni, of like, why aren't you joining? Like, why do you not join this group even though you're cooperating? And he's just like straight up like, I don't like these guys. Like, they do everything wrong. They're too extreme. I don't want to join them. But yet you still have this complete back and forth for several of these docs of, why aren't you joining? Because they suck. Why aren't you joining? I don't like them. And I think that's a super funny and kind of interesting dichotomy there. And really, I think, really excited for this paper because Ansar Islam is sort of this last unwritten node of the Iraqi jihadi insurgency that really has more outsized influence than what people really give it, credit for.
Yeah, it was a significant force in the north. I mean, that for sure.
Yeah. The interesting thing is Ansar al-Islam didn't have any different tactics than AQI. That's the pot calling the kettle black. Yeah. I mean, they did suicide bombings. They used foreign terrorists. They were al-Qaeda affiliated. I mean, they really didn't have any excuse. I don't know what the answer is because we haven't finished the research, but it's possible that personality wise, one let's just say one hypothesis is that Zarqawi came through Ansar al-Islam and they kind of sponsored him early before the invasion, right? And that's obviously been talked about. I think it was in the Colin Powell speech. U.S. even targeted him up there, in the early stages of the invasion, but missed him because he wasn't there. He'd already moved on, as we understand it. But at some point, and this is related to both projects I talked about, the foundation of the Islamic State. The Islamic State is largely founded by or led, and Mujahideen Shura Council is largely in 2006 is largely led by Ansar al-Islam veterans who defected to what would become the Islamic State, and they're very high prolific. Very much ran the media, ran the Mujahideen Shura Council. They were kind of a cohort that came over, and I think that instigated a lot of bad blood. They just kind of thought Zarqawi had came in and stolen all of their big names, and they never really relinquished that grudge. And as you mentioned, Shafi's run the organization, so I think 2010 he finally gets captured, and that kind of maybe is where Islamic State is able to start finally kind of stealing more of their guys, finish the job they started.
That reminds me of a document from the Bin Laden files from Pakistan where Al-Qaeda's, I believe it was, I can't remember who wrote it. It was either Atiyah Abdul Rahman or al-Libi.
Al-Libi, yeah.
Right, where he's saying, hey, stop poach. He's telling the TTP, saying, stop poaching our, trying to poach fighters from our Al-Qaeda companies. So this is something that does happen. I mean, the TTP obviously operated under the umbrella of Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban in many ways, but even then, there was always between these groups. You see that where they're trying to, again, poach leadership to get the best thing for its groups. Now, Craig, there's one thing I might have a small disagreement with you on here. Yeah. You had said that the Islamic State project of had failed, and I would argue it only failed because of the surge. Right. They controlled significant portions of Anbar, Diyala, Salahuddin, and Nineveh province before the surge. So I would argue what they did, and obviously they were doing it in conjunction with other jihadist groups and other Sunni, the Islamic Army of Iraq and whatnot. But a lot of that was rolled up under the Mujahideen Shura Council by that point. And I would argue they were pretty successful. It only took the U.S. intervention, only because of the U.S. intervention did it not really succeed. And then they really, after the U.S. withdrew within 3 years, they roar back on the scene, start taking over Anbar province. And that reminds me of I remember seeing a video. I did Tom Jocelyn and I did a debate with Peter Bergen and can't remember. It was Admiral Mullen's chief of staff, former chief of staff. And I remember Peter Bergen saying to me, Bill, Al Qaeda in Iraq is defeated. You saw it. You were there. And this was sometime in like 2012, I want to say. And my response was, that was in 2008, right? That was when I was in Mosul. Like, things are changed. I remember watching a video from Anbar in, let's say it was late 2011, early 2012, where watching them organize hundreds of fighters with captured Iraqi Humvees rolling into
Haditha. Yeah, that's
Haditha.
the Haditha raid.
Yeah, the Haditha raid, right? You got the dry run for the Islamic State's takeover. That's how how quickly these things change. That's the ebb and flow of jihad that we always talk about.
Which, shout out to Craig's paper. He has an amazing paper on the Haditha raid.
Oh, Craig, I didn't know that. You have to point me to that. I got to read that because
the Black Ops.
I remember writing that up and posting the video and being like, people, you need to look at this. This is what's on the horizon. Everyone ignored it.
Yeah, I was writing my dissertation at the time, and I watched that Haditha raid go down, and I'm like, oh, I'm no longer doing a post-mortem on, like you were saying, like I was there when kind of the surge really hit its stride, and, violence went from just the very peak to almost the exact opposite. And it was quite interesting, but one of the things we found in that political consolidation paper, and I don't think we don't have any daylight between us on this. I mean, they got their butts kicked. They kind of said, oh, hey, let's get back and reset. But it was that tactical. It was that, hey guys, from a strategic perspective, we need to go back, reset, and then kind of survive until the U.S. leaves. We know they're leaving. One of the things we found was that the awakening, as much as we hailed it as like, hey, we peeled these guys off of AQ, a lot of them are actually insurgents, not necessarily tribal people. They're kind of tribal people, but they're also, depending on where they were actually, former Islamic Army or whatever. And I know that just from my own personal experience. Our guys were all Islamic Army who kind of flipped and just didn't listen to their parent organization and became part of this awakening grassroots, but they were really in for controlling the local dynamics of where they lived, right? But one of the things we realized was that the awakening split a lot of these jihadi groups. And for every group that went to the pro-government, which wasn't a great move for them in the long run, because the government didn't really give them a lot of love and left them out kind of hanging out to dry, as did we. But when it split these other insurgent groups, the other half had nowhere to go, and they didn't want to join the government. So where do you think they went?
Yep.
And we didn't ever pay attention to that. We don't really have the curiosity to get like, well, what happens to the other half of his Islamic Army who decides there's no way they're joining the government or the Sawa or any other thing that's even close to it? Yeah, they're easy pickings for IS to recruit. And IS, if they have been one thing, they're serial, stealers of other people's, folks.
They're really good at it. I did a lot of embeds with military units that were working with the awakening, and boy, you always kept one eye open when you were with those guys. I mean, they were, like you said, it was a mixed bag. Some of them were local tribal leaders, some guys just looking for money, and some of these guys were hardcore insurgents who it was either wanted their wish I could remember this guy's name, but man, he looked like the Iraqi god. They called him, my memory's so bad these days, but I remember being in this one area and this guy displaying his Glock, and he was a former Islamic Army of Iraq guy, but all he wanted was, and this was an area just south of Baghdad along the Tigris River, and he just wanted to be his local warlord. It was incredible. Greg, what years were you in Iraq?
October 2006 all the way through the end of 2007. So did the long tour, courtesy of the surge.
Yeah, my last embed there was in the spring of 2008, and I was in Mosul, which was the last bastion of the Islamic State of Iraq at that point in time. And I was actually on the scene within a half hour of that suicide attack at Combat Outpost Inman, where it was actually executed by a former Guantanamo detainee from Qatar. The only way I found out is because someone pointed me to their video, and they're like, "Hey, Bill, they used your pictures," which was just pretty horrific. I needed a shower after that one.
I'll bet.
Yeah, the surge, that was certainly interesting. It's kind of back full circle here, right? We were talking about in the beginning of this how long we've been in this business. But I think Caleb, you were probably still in grade school when Craig and I were running around Iraq.
5th grade, 2005.
Well, you know what? We need new blood like yours to carry on for us old guys.
Yeah, I mean, talking about the next generation of leadership. I mean, it's also works two ways here.
That's right. It's our next generation of analytical leadership right here, Caleb Weiss.
That's right. That's right. I mean, inspiring papers that I'm working on and publishing, and many more.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Craig, always a pleasure. We got to get you on soon. You are one of our favorite guests here. I would say you and Edmund Fitton Brown, you probably win the award for most appearances.
He's better looking, and he's an ambassador, and
he has that British accent.
So he's got me in all three categories.
Yeah, well, that's okay. He doesn't know the Islamic State like you do. That's for sure. So, well, Craig, thanks again for joining us. Caleb, thanks for co-hosting with me. Thanks everyone for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Until next time, thank you very much.